Well, thank you all for coming. This is session 3 of evidence for the God hypothesis. And before we get to the opening prayer or whatever, I thought I'd talk a little bit about this slide here. This is Niels Bohr and Albert Einstein. And they kind of had, Niels Bohr basically was the I wouldn't know if he's the inventor, but the proposer of quantum mechanics. Okay, and Einstein kind of hated it. Okay, and so Einstein spent a good deal of the last years. It was like trying to come up with, Einstein used to do these things called thought experiments, and he tried to come up with some thought experiments that would show that quantum mechanics was incorrect. And quantum mechanics is kind of interesting in that it's very powerful for predicting the way, so atomic particles and how all that works, but it's kind of nonsensical. You can't really understand. You can predict it from the equations, you can't understand it. And another little thing I kind of learned years ago was that the wave equations they solved for quantum mechanics were solved in like the 1600s by a scientist or whatever, probably a lord. I don't remember exactly who it was, but he was asking questions like, if the earth was all water, what kind of standing waves would be supported on the surface? And he came up with all the equations for that. Those happen to be the same equations that work for quantum mechanics. So anyway, that was a little interesting to me. So, well, let's start with, move the cursor there. We'll start with the opening. Maybe we will. Maybe we will.
Sometimes it's finicky.
Oh, you gotta click it? Okay.
Sometimes.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Heavenly Father, you are the God of truth and wisdom. We thank you for the chance to think carefully, to ask honest questions and think what is real. Give us clarity of mind and humility of heart. Help us listen well, reason carefully, and remain open to where the truth leads. Where there is doubt, grant us patience. Where there is pain, grant us understanding. Where there's disagreement, grant us charity. May this time be marked by honesty, courage, and the genuine desire to know you more fully. Amen.
Amen. You click, there you go.
We'll go this one. Okay, so this is the return of the God hypothesis. And I thought I would just do a little bit of a review. All of these images, courtesy of either Grok or ChatGPT. Amazing. You say, hey, this is my slide. I want an image for that. Boom, there you go. Good. So session 1 review. Okay, so we talked about this in session 1. Early modern science grew inside of a theistic belief system. Okay, the coming of the 20th century and Darwin and the rise of materialism kind of pushed God out of the explanations for the origin. Okay, in the 1960s, science and cosmic beginnings kind of reopened the question again, particularly with the discovery of the Big Bang. Okay, so the belief is that a rational creator, created an intelligible universe, one that you could understand, and that you could discover the laws for that. So another theme at the time was that nature was like a book, and it was really a work of the mind. It was the words of God. So if you could read nature like a book, you would understand basically the mind of God. So early scientists we talked about were explicitly theistic. Kepler was thinking that he was thinking God's thoughts by studying nature and the laws of planetary motion. He was thinking the thoughts of God, okay? Boyle, the creator of modern chemistry, he thought that he was studying design wisdom in nature. And Newton, in his laws of motions, thought this was the evidence of the creator's power and the evidence of the order that God created in the universe. So we also talked about competing worldviews, the view of theism, deism, and pantheism and materialism. We discussed those. Okay, we talked about using abductive reasoning, okay, which is the inference to the best explanation as a way of deciding whether or not a certain set of facts represented the truth. And we compared worldviews by the scope and their explanatory power and the coherence of their explanation. So for session 2, we talked about fine tuning of the universe, okay, and that it's tuned at multiple levels and physical laws and cosmic conditions and planetary systems and biological systems are all finely tuned for life. Okay, the finely tuned involves very narrow life permitting ranges that it could easily have been different, but it's not. So we talked a little bit about chance, that chance is not a cause, and that if you try to use chance, it not only requires a trial mechanism, but it also requires a selection process. So natural laws, they describe regularities, but they don't really explain why these laws and why these values exist. So the multiverse is really the only scientific proposal for explaining the fine tuning of the universe. And this is like, well, you know, there's an infinite number of universes out there, so the one we live in just happens to be right. So it's kind of a weak explanation, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. Oops, what's going on now? It's thinking.
Oh, that's probably an internet issue for a moment,
Oh, okay.
just catching up. There you go.
Oh, okay, okay. No, we just did that one. Okay, session 3, what we're gonna talk about today. Well, we're gonna complete session 2, because I had too many slides and we need periodic development and consciousness. And then we'll do the material that I made for session 3, which is how you go from theism to Christianity. Zoom is not responding. You want to generate a crash report?
No. Zoom is, I'm just concerned about. Views.
Too many graphics.
Zoom still up.
Did it quit?
No, it's good to go.
Oh, okay. You're still connected, okay. So, so here's kind of really the roadmap for tonight's session. We completed the cosmic beginning last time, okay? We completed the fine tuning discussion, okay? So now we're gonna explore some of the mysteries on the origins of life. We're gonna talk particularly about complexity in development and like how fetuses develop or how, you know, basically life develops. And we're gonna talk about some of these ideas that this requires external information. And we're gonna talk somewhat about the mind and consciousness. And then some moral arguments for the existence of God. And then, of course, theism to Christianity. Okay. Well, it's changed up there.
Pretty picture.
There, okay. This is origin of life. We're going to talk mostly about embryonic development. So, the origin of life, this is kind of, we've talked in previous sessions about the chemistry of life, and in the stairway to life, we talked about all the different steps required. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the deeper aspects of the origin of life. So we asked in session 2, can chemistry alone explain the origin of life? And I think the answer is no. Okay. Now we ask, well, what kind of information must already exist for life to develop at all? And this is kind of a key shift, because the origin of life problem isn't really about making molecules, okay, but it's about the information that is required to build an organism during reproduction. It requires a lot of information is involved in the sequencing and the building of a new organism. So embryonic development, it requires layered information, okay? And so DNA, which we've talked about, it provides genes or genetic sequences, and those genetic sequences create the production of proteins in the cell, okay? So DNA is really the program for life, okay? It tells how to make life, but where's the machine that executes the program? Okay, and how did that come about? Because DNA just describes life, it doesn't create life. So the machine is the cell, okay? And that's the little machine that reads the DNA program and creates life. So you have in DNA, you have a long strand with thousands of genes on it, okay? And each gene can make a protein, okay? But there has to be a mechanism to control when proteins get made. They have to be made at the right time and in the right quantities, okay? You just can't make everything all at once. So there's a mechanism called epigenetic regulation, and it controls when proteins are generated in the cell. And they're generated when the cell needs them, and they're not generated when the cell doesn't need them. So another aspect of development is you need spatial and temporal coordination. The temporal is how you generate, how you grow an organism and how you generate that code, and spatial is how you organize the cells spatially. So, but all of this depends on pre-existing cellular machinery. Okay, it's not just the DNA. There has to be, the cellular machinery has to be pre-existing, and it's kind of a chicken and egg problem. So let's talk about the development information. Well, we know science knows that it comes from outside of the genome or outside of the DNA. So the correct claim is that the development is distributed across the cellular system, and it's also distributed across the DNA. It's stored in the cell architecture and the epigenetics. We talked about the expression, and a bunch of dynamics is associated with regulating the production of all the materials that the cell uses. So this is kind of mainstream biology, okay? So we know it's external to the DNA sequence, okay? In the scientific sense, this is valid. It is external, okay? Information exists outside of the DNA, okay? It's in the cell architecture, in the epigenetics, and in the regulatory systems that control this. Okay, this is also mainstream biology. We're going to get to the good part. So it's external to the embryo. Okay, now some claim it's even external to life itself, and we'll maybe talk a little bit about that. In the biological sense, yeah, this is partially valid. early development depends on maternal contributions. You can't grow an embryo without the mother, okay? And it's not just the mother providing the egg, it's the mother providing a number of things that control the development. So proteins, RNA, and structures are supplied by the egg that get this whole process started. But this is still part of the biological system. So there's some complexity in this whole development process. So how genes get turned on and how proteins are generated in the proper sequence depends on a number of factors. Depends on where the cell is with respect to, where it's respect to north and south, I guess, but also with respect to its neighbors, okay? Because, we're gonna grow a head, we wanna grow it in the right place, we don't wanna grow it in the wrong place. Okay? So, it's also, the expression depends on history, what has happened before, okay? It depends on mechanical stress between cells, okay? It depends on what the neighboring cells are doing, okay? And it depends on what they call the epigenetic state, which is kind of the state of this machine that's growing the organism. So the same gene can produce different outcomes, different proteins, and in some cases, one gene can produce 80,000 different proteins, okay? But which ones get produced, okay? And how does it decide which were produced? So there's activation and suppression going on depending on the timing. So some argue, and I think this was presented in one of the previous classes, that embryonic development requires some kind of control system, okay? And I remember reading a book about this, but I can't remember what the book was. But they were saying that it's functionally equivalent to a massive state machine. We'll talk a little bit about what a state machine, and that the state machine is so complex. Some say that it's more complex than the entire universe. It can't be expressed. The number of states is astronomical to control all the cells in the body and all of the various internal states of the cell. So some people argue that this requires God, that God is involved. External agency is involved during the development of life. So what does that external source of information actually mean? It's external to nature. That's it's not a scientific conclusion, okay, to say, well, God's involved in the development of every creature, every embryo, okay. But it's more of a worldview kind of level explanation of how all this order systems exist at all. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But in Psalm 139, kind of maybe shed some light on this. This is David's celebration that God knows you completely and formed you intentionally. And so it reads, "For you formed my inner parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb." Okay. When I read something like that, I find it kind of interesting that, gee, why is this? Why would they be telling us this? Okay, that seems kind of, maybe it's because now we have questions about some of this stuff. Okay, and here's an answer that's been there for thousands of years that's related to questions now we're asking about this subject. So life unfolds according to a rational order. And it's not an order that comes from, according to the Psalm, doesn't come from the organism, it comes from God. So modern biology shows that the development depends on layers of information, and these layers of information come outside of the DNA. So
Kurt,
yes.
so Psalm 139, you think explains the metaphysical sense that it has to be an external explanation for how it developed.
Yeah, well, it's like, you see these arguments that say, well, it's a very complex problem orchestrating all of this.
But it's not a biological sense, it's a metaphysical.
Well, some people have made arguments that, I think they describe this, the complexity of this is uncomputable.
Right?
Okay, you couldn't build a machine large enough that could orchestrate all of the things that had to happen to develop an embryo, okay? But that, that's somewhat speculative, okay? And kind of the way science pitches it, and I think we might have a slide on this a little later, but is that, oh, well, this is not like a single machine, it's just a whole network. There's all kinds of things going on in all different areas, and somehow those are all coordinated. That doesn't sound to me like that makes the problem simpler. It sounds like it makes it more complicated. Okay, if it was hard enough just to conceive of like a computer program that's gonna say, do this and do that.
So there might be like a single mind, like God.
This is what some say, and it's not something that you could prove or disprove. Science says, no, it's all, there's plenty there. We know it's in there, we just don't know how it's in there, right? So that comes from kind of the premise is that, well, first we're gonna deny any external influence, right? That's kind of like the premise of science. We're not going to, we would never say, oh, well, that is an external agency that's doing this, right? So information to control the development process, information alone is not enough. It requires control decisions that talk about when and where and how genes get activated, how proteins get produced, how RNA gets produced, and how it gets used. Okay, so this leads us to ask the question, what kind of system can manage this level of coordinated decision making? Okay, and we already said it's pre-existing. Okay, this came from the mother cell. It's not invented after conception. It came from the mother cell.
Kurt?
Yeah.
Not only that, it's repeatable.
Yes.
Look at the fact that there's a Kurt and a Mark and
Right.
all the others in the room. It's repeated time after time after time, reliably.
Yes, and I have a slide on that. I have no, it's a good point. It's a good point. So I thought I would just mention, we talk about a big state machine. Well, what is a state machine? So it's a state machine is a system that it has, it's discrete or continuous states. In most cases, we think of it as discrete state. Okay, there's transitions between the state, and I'll give you an example. Okay, there's rules from going from one state to the next state. Okay, so a recipe is kind of a state machine, right? Okay, get the flour, mix the flour, add the salt, stir in the eggs, whatever. That is kind of, you go from one state to the other state. So, but it produces reliable, this state machine or state machines in general produce reliable outcomes. No matter how many times you run it, it runs the same. So embryonic development exhibits exactly this kind of behavior. Okay. Cells move through distinct developmental states. So here's kind of an example of like what a state machine, the developmental state machine might look like. You start with a fertilized egg, you move to cell division, then you make this thing called a blastocyst that I seem to remember, where it kind of forms a shell, the cells kind of form a shell. And you go through all of these different steps and you end up with organ formation, and then boom, you've got an embryo. So, but how does this occur? How do all these steps occur? So there's a guy named Eric Davidson. He's probably a molecular biologist, and he wrote a paper on the regulatory genome. How do genes get expressed. How does this work? And so he says it's governed by these things that are called regulatory networks. GRNs, gene regulatory networks. And you can kind of draw a diagram of these things, but basically a bunch of different chemical steps, okay? So they function as a control system, hierarchical control system. They're like logic networks, okay? And they have state transition architectures built into it. So the early in development, when these networks are functioning, they're highly conserved. It's, in other words, from generation to generation to generation, these are always the same, okay? They're very resistant to gradual changes. You can't go in there and tweak something in this network and get something that's a little better. You go in there and you make random changes to it and it breaks it. Okay, it's a pretty complicated process. And that's kind of the assumption of evolution. Well, there'll be these small random changes and one of them will make the cell very, very smart, you know? So, so they act as hard constraints on the possible outcomes of the development process. So why does this matter? So Davidson explicitly describes the development as it's rule-based, it's sequential, it's state-dependent, and it's robust against noise. You try to disturb the system and it corrects itself, okay? Which is nice, because that's why we're here today, because it's robust. So it's a biological state machine. Okay, so he doesn't infer a creator. Davidson doesn't, get into religious aspects to answer how these state machines get created. But his work pretty much implies it. So he openly admits that the systems are extraordinarily difficult to evolve these things gradually, okay? And small changes are catastrophic to the function. You go in and you change a molecule here or there and it doesn't work anymore. It's like a watch, take a part out, doesn't work. So from a deeper philosophical point, you got to ask the question, why does nature contain systems like this that reliably generate order, goal-directed organisms at all? Why? What drives nature to this state? So, Psalm 139 answers the question by pointing to the intention of God. Okay, and science shows us that life is governed by complex inherited information. The whole development process that's going on in the cell from conception on is driven by inherited information. So why does this matter philosophically? Information is a mental category. Instructions involve purpose and they involve direction. And we know that minds generate information. We don't know any other way that information gets generated. We know that minds generate information. So if information is inherited, how did it get originated? If it's passed on from generation to generation, so inheritance doesn't explain the origin of this information. Okay, it just explains how it's passed on. And modern biology shows it's inherited across generations and it's distributed across multiple layers in the cell, the DNA, the epigenetic codes, the cellular architecture, and all the regulatory nature. So where did it come from? So let's explore some possibilities of where it come from. Okay. So the first about the science's answer, chance. That's how it came. That's the answer to everything. Oh, random mutation. So we know random processes, they generate variation. We know they generate noise. We know they generate disorder, but they don't generate functionally specific sequences that are able to do some kind of job. Okay, they don't generate coordinated control systems. Okay, and they don't generate codes, which DNA is a code and it has meaning. They don't noise, random chance doesn't generate meaning. So chance requires, as we mentioned before, a trial mechanism, and it requires a selection criteria, which is, that principle of evolution. But those already presuppose the functions and the information. Okay, so it's kind of like a circular argument. So every proposed mechanism pre-proposes some of the information it's supposed to explain. This doesn't seem to bother people. So here's how can another way this could happen? Well, how about there's some natural law? Well, natural laws describe regularities, they constrain behavior, and they do the same thing every time. They don't select goals, they don't specify sequences, they don't generate novel instructions. Natural laws don't do that. They control when you drop the apple if it falls on Newton's head. So a law can explain why something happens. Once the system exists, you can explain how it works, but it can't explain why this system exists. So here's another guess. Let's guess self-organization. See how smart that AI is when I say self-organization? You get a bunch of words. Self-organization produces pattern. It produces order. It produces repetition. Okay, but patterns don't equal instructions. Okay, self-organization does not explain the coding in the DNA. The DNA symbols spell out a message. Okay, the message is the message of life. The functional semantics, the sequences are functional and they have meaning. Okay, and it doesn't generate the context sensitive control that you have in the development of an organism. So the key distinction is, information versus order. Order is regularity, like crystals and waves, or ripples in sand on the beach. But information is specific to a function. So life requires specified information. It doesn't just order, there's specified information in it. So this question is why, for decades, people have worked on this, and a lot of money and a lot of effort's been spent on it, and they still don't have the answer. So this was my favorite, the regression problem. Okay, this is kind of the heart of the question of the information. It's passed on. If information is inherited, and inheritance requires prior information, you have the classical regression. Information requires information, requires information, requires information. Okay, so how do you get out of that point? Well, one way to terminate this chain is what they call a brute fact. Okay, that it exists without explanation. Okay, this is like, when your mother told you because I said so. Okay, this information is there because I said so. Don't ask me why. Okay, or a fundamentally different kind of cause. Okay, that can originate the information rather than just copy it. And so that points to some kind of law, but we've decided that laws can't do that. Okay, or an agency or a mind. So it seems to point, this information seems to point to a mind. Okay. So, like we say, what kind of causes generate information? Well, we know from daily life, a uniform experience, and this is not a God of the gaps argument. A God of the gaps argument is, well, I don't know this, so God must have did it. Okay, this is an inference based on everybody's experience, and we know the information, it comes from minds. languages, codes, software, blueprints, algorithms, they all come from minds. None of them come from nature, okay? They don't come from chemistry, they don't come from randomness, there's no systematic or physical necessity that creates them. So it doesn't prove anything, but it's kind of a powerful argument or inductive insight. So let's look at the philosophical options on the table here. There's only a few possibilities, okay? The brutal fact, this is, okay, the information is, it just is, because I said it was, so it is. That's not a real, very deep explanation, okay? It's logically possible, but it doesn't really explain anything. Okay, option 2 is necessity. The laws of nature had to produce life. There is no other alternative. Well, that doesn't, there's not really any evidence that says that that's true. Okay, and fine tuning kind of argues against it. So,
Also, life exists on this planet as we experience it. Where else does life exist? Wouldn't it be necessary on Mars or Uranus or Alpha Centauri or whatever?
well, you know, when we talked last time about why the universe is the way it is, and there were some 60 some parameters. Okay, and he said it was unlikely that there would be another planet in the universe that would meet all of these parameters.
Agreed,
It's-
but the necessity remains even so. Yet life didn't form out of necessity in these places that mathematically just don't,
Right,
allow for the possibility.
Right.
So necessity can't be the explanation at all.
right. And so when I look at this, you know, I try to answer the question, are there aliens, right? It seems obvious to me from all of this, if they are, that's because God made them.
Right.
Because they didn't just happen to be, oh, well, that, we chose green for that. You know, so the other option is of course, the multiverse, you know. Let's multiply by infinity. If the chance is 0, we'll multiply by infinity, we'll get a number like 1. It's not an answer, all it does is move the question up, okay? Well, where did the multiverse's information generating capacity come from? You know? I guess it came from infinity. Option 4 is kind of the mind, and we've talked about that information originates from intentional agencies, and laws are instruments, not sources. And this aligns with our experience, okay? And it aligns with the nature of life, the informational nature of life, and the rational intelligibility of nature. So the bottom line is biological information is clearly inherited, okay? But inheritance only explains transmission, doesn't explain the origin. And the deeper question is, what kind of cause can originate the integrated, functionally specific information in the first place? So its ultimate origin must lie in something capable of generating information. And the inheritance can't do that by itself. So our answer is, well, this comes from the mind of God. So, and it doesn't seem that, you know, science offers a better answer than that. They can only answer chance or multiply by infinity. So I think this is interesting, okay? You know, in John 1:3-4, it says all things were created by him, and apart from him, not one thing was created that has been created. In him was life, and life was the light of mankind. So life flows from logos, okay, which is kind of fascinating to me. I discovered a few years ago, you know, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Greek word is logos, okay, and logos not only means word, okay, and reason, but it also means God's divine plan. So you can read that. But in the beginning was God's divine plan, right?
Mhm.
And the divine plan was God. Okay, that God was the plan and God is the plan. So I thought that was interesting. But so life is grounded, we believe, in rational agency, not chance, and existence and order share a common source, the mind of God. So this passage connects the creation, the reason for creation, and life. So seems to be a pretty good, maybe I'm biased, but seems to be a pretty good explanation. Flip the switch.
There we go. Oh,
Okay, now we're gonna talk a little bit about consciousness, the mind and meaning. So, thoughts are about things, okay? Neurons aren't about anything,
mhm.
okay? And the meaning transcends the mechanism. You got the neurons and everything, but that's not the mind, okay? Those aren't the thoughts. The meaning is on top of that. So let's talk a little bit about reason, a thing called normativity, okay, which is a big fancy word, and morality. So reason, so science assumes trustworthy reasoning, that you can reason about a problem and you can trust your reasoning. So if you say, well, minds are accidents of nature, okay, then that kind of undermines this whole idea that you can trust what? You can trust your own thoughts, you can trust your own reason. Normativity is the idea of oughts. Things ought to be a certain way. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But naturalism struggles with grounding these kinds of ideas of normativity. And by grounding, we mean to provide a foundational justification. Why are things the way they are? Why are things the way they ought to be? So, morality is, we're talking about the objective moral experience a little bit, okay? And that requires some foundational work beyond just preference. So on reason and rationality, so science assumes trustworthy reason. For science to work at all, you have to assume that logical laws are valid, okay? Reasoning isn't systematically deceptive, okay? And our beliefs can correspond to reality, and the world is intelligible. So if minds are an accident of nature, well, it kind of undermines all of that. So, rational sources grounds rational thought. So rational thought is best explained as reality has a rational foundation, okay? A source that is itself is mind-like. So you and I can reason, and that means we form beliefs, we weigh evidence, and we aim at the truth, and it's just not about usefulness. We don't say, reasoning came about because it was useful for the survival of an organism. It's more than that. So, and we expect our conclusions to correspond with reality. So the whole structure of mind is really what supports scientific endeavor. So science and math depend on all of that. So if minds are accidental, why trust? I want to talk a little bit about objective moral experience. Okay, so our experience tells us there is some objective moral laws or moral obligations. So some acts seem objectively wrong. So, and this is preserved across cultures, there's a remarkable agreement on what is morally right, okay, what are moral obligations and prohibitions. Okay, especially when you're talking about harm, faithfulness, loyalty. So there are these basic moral categories. And it's not really personal preference. So, moral relativism, which we see a lot of, really denies the existence of objective morals. But we're gonna try to show that there are objective morals. On normativity, so naturalism struggles with this whole idea of ought, okay? And by ought, we mean normativity, we mean things that we ought to believe or what we ought to do, or what counts as good or bad reasoning, okay? And what makes a belief justified or unjustified. So an example, you ought to believe what evidence supports. You have evidence to support something, you ought to believe that, okay? You ought to not torture children, okay? These are things that most everybody agrees on. These are the way things should be, okay? And that validity of an argument or whatever is objective. It's a rule that tells you what you ought to conclude if you accept the premises. So if all humans are mortal and Socrates is a human, then Socrates is mortal. That follows whether you like it or not. Okay, that is a objective truth. Okay.
Caesar didn't like that though.
Huh?
Caesar didn't agree
No, I
with that.
guess not.
He was the exception.
They made him drink the hemlock, yes. But persuasion is psychological. What we should believe is not always identical to what we do believe. So, but theism provides a foundation for all of this, which is naturalism or science really can't provide that foundation. So let's talk a little bit about the moral arguments for God. So objective moral values and duties require a foundation, a transcendental foundation, which we feel is best explained by God. Something that can make these morals binding, even if people disagree about them. So the argument, when we talked about this, I believe in the first class, the argument is a deductive argument. God does not exist. Objective morals and duties do not exist. But we believe that objective morals and duties do exist. Therefore, we would conclude an argument that God does exist. Kind of a deductive. I'm sure you can question that. So without God, morals reduce to subjective preferences, right? Or you say they're evolutionary byproducts or cultural conventions, and they lack a binding force. Okay, they're not obligations. So naturalism leads to this moral nihilism. Okay, no objective right and wrong, sort of only survival adaptations. Okay, like rape might only be wrong if it hinders gene propagation. Okay. That would be your naturalistic view on things. But God speaks on objective morals. In Romans, this is kind of interesting. He says, for wherever the Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature the things required by the law, these who do not have the law are a law unto themselves. They show that the works of the law is written on their heart, as if their conscience bears witness. So this is kind of, God wrote the moral laws on the hearts of man. So theism provides a unified explanation for the information, for consciousness, for reason, and moral obligation. And this is something that, materialistic naturalism cannot provide. And it's not as a gap filler, but it's a coherent explanatory framework. So let's look at the cumulative evidence here. There was a cosmic beginning. Okay, there was fine tuning. There's biological information. There's conscious minds. And there's moral awareness. So we'll go back and we'll look and see how these relate to the worldviews of theism, deism, pantheism, and materialism. So which worldview explains the most? So how much scope is how much data is explained? Power is the depth of the explanation, and is it internally consistent? So if we go back to the God hypothesis, it's not opposed to, it can coexist with science. Okay, the God hypothesis, it has been historically fruitful. The entire scientific endeavor was based on theistic beliefs. Okay, it's motivated, structured, and stabilized not only intellectual but cultural developments across centuries. So the God hypothesis has generated philosophical work and cosmological arguments, dealt with the problem of evil, divine attributes, freedom, and normativity. It's exponentially powerful, and it offers a unified account of the phenomenon that rival hypotheses struggle to explain, and they don't address in a comprehensive manner, including the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning, the consciousness, and morality. But this isn't a proof, okay? Abductive arguments are probabilistic. And you say, given the data, which explanation makes the most sense? So we're saying, given the data we've seen, the theistic explanation makes the most sense. But reasonable people can disagree on this, which is, and they have. So, but faith is not irrational. So now we're going to talk, the third session, the center of the third session is from theism. How do we go from theism to Christianity? So it's which God should we believe in and which story? So we're going to talk about from God to a personal God. So the philosophical arguments point to a cause, okay, but they don't tell us about God's character. Okay, but revelation has to be historical to be meaningful. Okay, if it's not historical, if it's only internal or mystical, then you can't publicly evaluate it. Okay, and then it collapses into a private experience. So competing claims, if it's not historical, there's no public or objective way to tell which is true. There's no shared criteria for evaluation, okay? And each claim only relies on private experience or internal conviction. So this leads to relativism. This is true for me, but it's maybe not true for everybody. So there are some objections to the idea of theism. Okay, it's kind of interesting. Problem of evil. Okay, there's evil in the world. A fawn dying in a forest fire, it demands justification that aligns with a loving creator's purpose. Why would God allow things like this to happen? Okay, there's the God of the gaps concern. Mysterious phenomena are attributed to God because they're mysterious. Okay. But the materialistic view on this is, well, every gap is filled with accidents. If we don't know how it happened, well, then it had to be an accident or a random variation. So, and then there's a objection called religious pluralism. So basically, if a single personal God intended to reveal himself to humanity, okay, there's many conflicting revelations, and it suggests that since there are many conflicting revelations, suggests that none of them is uniquely authoritative, and, therefore, none of them are to be considered reliable.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the problem of evil. So Romans 8:20 says, creation is subjected to futility. Okay, maybe that's the reason for it, but there's the free will defense, okay? How many agree with this? It says basically, love and moral goodness require freedom. So God allows evil because he allows freedom of choice. Okay, so that, you can understand that in some respects, but it doesn't explain all suffering. Doesn't explain Bambi getting burned up in the forest fires. Okay, so the second explanation is, well, evil makes for good character. Okay, that suffering is necessary to have courage and compassion and endurance. They all require difficulty. And a painless world would lack certain moral depths. That doesn't seem too persuasive an argument to me. So it helps with some natural evil, but it really doesn't explain it all. So my personal feeling is it's maybe a combination of the first, okay, free will and something in the limits of human perspective. So just because we don't know the reason for something doesn't mean there's no reason. So I don't know how you interpret or deal with this, or what your guys' thoughts are on it. So, I guess you could say maybe God's a communist, in the end justifies the means. In the end, okay, God will wipe away every tear from their eyes and death will be no more. So in the end, maybe much of the suffering doesn't matter that much, because in the end, it will be wiped away. So God enters through something. Christianity claims that God participates in human suffering. And of course, the cross is central to this idea. God is not distant from pain. So Scripture itself voices protest and lament over evil and over suffering. The faith does not silence the question of suffering. The problem of evil is taken seriously in the Bible. Let's talk a little bit about Christianity and how that relates. So many worldviews affirm some kind of God, but Christianity makes specific historical claims about God. And these claims can be and must be validated and not assumed. So in Acts, it says, from one man, he made every nation of the human race so that they would seek God. When it comes to the incarnation, in John, it says, the word became flesh and took up residence among us. So God becomes human and he suffers with humanity. So it's not abstract, but it's participatory. So, historical events in the Bible, and in Corinthians it says, if Christ had not been raised, our preaching was futile. So Christianity depends on historical events. It's not if it's false historically, then Christianity fails. It's not just a philosophy. So let's look at some of the historical events. So Jesus of Nazareth existed. We know that. He's written about in places other than the Bible. Okay. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. We know that. Okay. This is pretty much accepted across the scholarly spectrum. So, in terms of the historical resurrection, this is the central claim of Christianity. It validates Jesus' identity, transforms the meaning of suffering and death. Okay, death is overcome through Christ. Okay, and if it's false, Christianity fails. So, its resurrection is key. The claim is public, it's historical, and it's testable. So we know that Jesus was crucified. It's written about historically. It's kind of unlikely invention. We know his tomb was empty, okay, and his followers sincerely believed he rose. In fact, they were willing to suffer death for that belief. So,
It did.
So we can say that the resurrection best explains the historical data we have. Why does it explain it? Okay. In Acts, it says, this Jesus God raised up, and we are all witnesses of it. So it fits the Jewish context. The Jews believed in the resurrection, but they only believed it at the end of history. Okay, and the resurrection explanation accounts for the data that was observed with the fewest assumptions. So the resurrection is a historical claim. Paul says if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is futile. But Christianity falls or rises on this event, and the resurrection is publicly proclaimed. Christian faith is falsifiable. You could demonstrate whether or not these claims are true from history. So to kind of summarize which God and which story. So philosophy points to a cause, but it's not God's character, but not to God's character or his intentions. Meaningful revelation must be historical, publicly testable, and distinguishable from completing claims. Purely private or mystical revelations collapses into relativism. And Christianity makes historical claims that can be evaluated. You don't have to assume it. And the problem of evil is confronted in the Bible. It's not ignored. It's through freedom, moral formation, and the limits of human perspective. So Christianity uniquely claims God enters suffering, and the cross is central to this. And so faith stands or falls on the events of time, especially resurrection. And faith is not blind belief. It's a trust grounded in evidence. So for our final reflection, in Acts it says this was not done in a corner. Science points to causes beyond belief, beyond itself. The universe is intelligible and ordered. The God hypothesis remains alive. Christianity is historically grounded, it's serious, and it deserves careful consideration. So, as John says, do not continue in your unbelief, but believe. Oh. I thought as a little afterward I would talk about the young earth. Okay? So there's biblical support for the young earth. Okay. The 24-hour days in there's support for considering the days to be 24-hour days. Okay. There's a repeated statement of an evening and a morning for each day. The days are numbered, the first day, the second day. The day is contrasted with the night. Okay, there's the Sabbath pattern, 6 days the Lord made the earth and rested. Okay. There's genealogies, okay, that from Adam all the way to Christ. Okay. Then there's the idea that death entered the world through Adam, okay? And that no death existed, even animals before that. And the idea that, the words very good is read in Genesis, meaning that there was no death or suffering prior to Adam's foundation. And the flood is read as a global and geologically decisive events. So why do Christians disagree about this? Okay, well, the debate is mostly interpretational. Okay, whether Genesis is intended as a strict chronology or whether genealogies are complete, or are they telescoped? Okay, are there missing pieces in the genealogy, and whether the death includes all animal death or it's just human or spiritual death. So these are kind of points of disagreement. But I maintain that regardless of which you believe, whether you believe in a young earth or whether you believe in an old earth, it doesn't change any of the arguments that were in the God hypothesis.
Here.
So, it doesn't really matter. Maybe one day we'll know. So some general questions, is which line of evidence do you feel was the strongest? To me, I find the evidence for life, fine tuning, those are kind of abstract, it seems to me. It seems to me that the arguments about life, the arguments about the origin of life and how difficult it would be to be accidental, probably the strongest,
Yeah.
maybe carry the most weight.
Well, it's awful hard to imagine information being created accidentally or by some
Yeah,
non-described procedure. I mean,
it's
you gotta
like,
have the information to create information, so.
right, how did it? Well, to me too, the fact that it's so interlocking, everything is all, it almost all had to exist at the same time. Almost like it had to be created. And then there's that, what they call the watchmakers, what do they call that? The puzzle or whatever, where you're walking along the beach and you find a watch and your first thought isn't, well, how did this evolve? Right? The watches are a lot simpler than life, that's for sure. Yeah.
Well, and you can take that argument from the other direction too. If you don't believe God and you believe everything came together through random processes over time, lots of time, then randomness by its very nature is noise. You can think of white noise and so on.
Right.
How do you get information from random nothing?
Right, and randomness.
There's no information there. It's the opposite of information. It's deliberate chaos, if you will.
And it tends to destroy things. Randomness tends to destroy things, not build things.
Well, it certainly doesn't build anything,
Right,
right?
right. I sort of described as like the tornado goes through a town, destroys everything, and then the next day another tornado comes back and puts it all back together. So,
Yeah, but better than it was before.
yeah,
Metal doesn't rust anymore, stuff.
yeah.
Or it goes through a junkyard and creates a 747.
Yeah.
Yeah, right, yeah. Puts it back together, so.
That's the concept of entropy, which I believe you talked about in the first session. Entropy talks about continuing disorder,
Right,
not order as things advance.
right. Yeah, I think there was a famous saying where they said, entropy shows that basically the universe is running down. Okay,
Mhm.
so if the universe is running down, who wound it up? True.
And how does thought, reason continue to advance with entropy running through, the processes that bring
Right,
thought and reason, to
well,
new levels?
life kind of runs counter to entropy, right?
Well, at
It
least
creates
reason and thought
order.
do, yeah.
Order is created out of disorder. Um, I did have one slide here, we didn't talk about this, I think it was covered in the book, whoops, the Cambrian explosion. So, about 500 million years ago, 540 some million years ago, you see an explosion of all the different, I think they call it speciation. A number of species were observed in the fossil record, and it was over a handful of millions of years, not billions of years, okay? And so, the scientists claim, well, they didn't have body, the cells didn't have hard structures or whatever that could be preserved in the fossil record. But then when I think about that, then there's been trilobites, right,
Right,
for many, many, many millions of years. So it seemed like those were all preserved. But there was a large increase in animal diversity, a bunch of new body plans from starfish to, to monkeys. I don't think they really had monkeys quite then, but
yeah.
so, so this kind of seems to run counter to the idea of gradual evolution. So. Anyway.
So is God an experimenter?
Well, I don't know. You got some of these, you say, well, there's evidence of these things being changing in the fossil record. Some of my friends would say, well, the devil made all those fossils.
Well, but is the progression from one fossil to the next epoch of fossils, is it gradual or is it sudden?
It's sudden in the,
Exactly.
right,
So is God trying this out, then trying that out, and then later tries out Adam?
yeah.
Is God a learning God? Is that even possible?
God does not
If it's
change.
all knowing, how does he learn? I mean,
Yeah, it wouldn't seem to be. Wouldn't seem to be possible.
Bert, I spent many years at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and I was always surprised by the great lengths that certain scientists would go to deny a single mind.
Yeah,
I mean, they would jump through hoops
sure.
to say it wasn't true. What's your experience in the scientific community with that?
Well, I worked at Sandia, the
Yeah, okay.
sister organizations.
Yeah.
There'd be a little rivalry there. We didn't talk very much about it. And maybe that's because it's more of an engineering lab than a scientific lab. But it wasn't discussed very much. The thing I think is interesting though is a lot of this stuff. I mean, there's a lot of questions here, and you don't have to say, well, this proves God or anything, but there's a lot of questions, but those questions don't seem to be entertained. When the material is presented, it's presented, well, this is the way it is, right? There's not any possibility that that might not be right, or that that's not a complete explanation for things. And in all this reading I did on this stuff, it just seems like there's a lot of things that aren't understood, and there's a lot of things that aren't explained. They still can't explain how first life occurred, how the first cell was created. They can't explain that. And
So what do you think of the discovery that they made this month regarding from the quantum vacuum? Have you
Oh.
heard about that?
I know I had,
Making something out of nothing?
oh, yeah, quantum fluctuations. Well, that's where the Big Bang come from. Quantum fluctuations.
So let me read this short
Okay.
summary. In a groundbreaking moment that challenges everything we thought we knew about reality, the world's first particle collider has confirmed the impossible. Matter can spontaneously emerge from what appears to be absolute nothingness. Scientists have captured evidence that the quantum vacuum, long thought to be empty space, is actually a seething cauldron of potential where particles flicker in and out of existence. This isn't just a scientific curiosity, it's proof that the very fabric of our universe may have originated from the void itself. The STAR collaboration at Brookhaven National Laboratory analyzed millions of proton-proton collisions to identify particle pairings that indicate the presence of virtual quarks. The study confirms that virtual particles, which appear and disappear according to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, can become real matter when given an energetic boost. So they say they've collected evidence at Brookhaven that by colliding particles together in nothing,
So they
So
took a
when-
whole bunch of
when given it-
nothings and put it together and had
Well,
something.
this is,
When given an energetic boost in the nothingness,
into nothing.
where does this energy come from in the nothingness?
Well,
That gives it
they
the boost?
created it.
Well, how about
This
that?
experiment,
How about that?
but they're
I
saying
think
that
this, it seems to me that this is only new to that journalist. Because, I mean, this has been discussed even when I was in college, it was discussed about the idea that, nature abhors a vacuum. And
Yes,
that even in a vacuum, you have these particle pairs that being created and destroyed. There's like some quantum foam underlying the universe, right?
I think there's been theories, but I think they now say they have evidence of it.
Right, yeah, and then there's kind of in a similar thing, there's like black holes, right? In the black holes, there's evaporation at the boundary. Particles can be created and one will go into the black hole and the other one will escape. And so there's a method by which, well, this is all in the quantum theory, like the idea of quantum tunneling. You take an infinite potential, okay, and you have an electron and it'll still end up on the other side. Okay, so even though it would take an infinite amount of energy, it can still end up on the other side. So that's like I said, the quantum theory is great at making predictions, okay, but it doesn't make any sense.
yeah, one of my professors years ago said you could take an infinite number of monkeys and throw them at that wall, and one of them would go through the crack
Yes.
between the bricks.
One would, yes. That's the multiverse idea, I guess.
Yeah, It's the concept of infinity proving the impossible,
Right,
because mathematically, there's no such thing as a zero. There's only an approximation of nothingness. So the odds aren't zero that something can happen.
right, that's like you have an electron, that's going around an atom and it's kind of a probability function. And if you go anywhere in space, you go to Alpha Centauri, there's some non-zero probability that an electron will be in Alpha Centauri. And then the next moment it'll be back at that atom, so a lot of it just doesn't make sense.
Not logically, no.
So that was what Einstein's concern was, that why would the universe be made this way? And maybe it's a big theistic joke on us. Okay, well, I finished a little early, but
Good for you.
let's maybe close in prayer here. I thought, well, maybe we could just read this. This was from Ephesians, the prayer for the strengthening of love. And for this reason, I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named. I pray that according to the wealth of his glory, he may grant you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in the inner person, and that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, so that because you have been rooted and grounded in love, you may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and the length and the height and the depth, and thus know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled up in all the fullness of God.
Amen.
Amen.